Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is the Canon RF 35mm f1.8 macro, the smallest, lightest and cheapest lens for the EOS R mirrorless system to date, and for me one of the most compelling. In my full review I'll show you what it can do and why it should be in every EOS R owner's collection. The RF 35mm 1.8 was actually one of the first 4 lenses launched with the EOS R system back in September 2018 and represented the affordable end of the group. At $500 or pounds though, few would exactly describe it as being bargain basement, but 2 years later it actually remains the cheapest native lens in what so far turned out to be a fairly premium price system. And to be fair, while you could adapt the EF 35mm f2.8, that lens actually costs roughly the same, sometimes even a little bit more depending on where you live. The RF 35 1.8 is a pretty compact lens measuring 63mm long, 74mm in diameter and weighing 305 grams. The filter thread is 52mm, but sadly there's no weather sealing on this lens. Fit it on any of the EOS R bodies, but particularly the smallest RP, and you'll have yourself a very portable combination. For comparison, here it is next to the RF 24-105 f4L zoom, which is clearly considerably bigger. The barrel is pretty simple with a smooth manual focusing ring in the middle and a customizable control ring towards the front. A handy feature and notable here since the subsequent 24-105 STM and 24-240mm both reduced cost by combining their manual focus and custom control rings onto a single switchable ring. I get the impression if the RF35 were designed today, it would probably have 1, not 2 physical rings. As one of the more affordable lenses in the system, Canon's equipped the RF35 with an STM focusing motor, and you can see it in action here focusing for stills with the EOS R camera. The focusing is fairly swift for a lower priced lens, but the STM motor that Canon's employed is far from silent, at least when shooting stills, as you can hear. Luckily, movie shooters need not be alarmed, as when filming video the lens automatically slows down and focuses almost silently, as you can hear in this clip. Oh, and I filmed this with a built-in microphone, so it would be even quieter if you used an external mic. Moving on, the RF35 1.8 has sufficiently respectable close-up capabilities for Canon to add the macro tag to its title. In fact, it was the first native RF lens to claim macro capabilities, although it's since been joined by the RF 85mm f2 macro, which costs around $100 or pounds more. Both lenses fall short of delivering 1:1 reproduction, but they will give you 1:2 reproduction or 50% magnification. The RF 35mm 1.8 does so from a distance of 17cm compared to 35cm on the RF 85mm, so if macro is your primary concern, you should choose the lens based on your preferred working distance. In practice, the RF 35 1.8 allowed me to capture a subject that measured 72mm wide, confirming the 1:2 specification from a sensor that measures 36mm in width. It's nice and sharp too, right into the corners, especially if you can stop it down as I've done here to f8. Here's a bunch of photos I took at fairly close range, and apart from my previous formal measurement, it was refreshing to rarely, if ever, bump up against the minimum focusing distance. I'm also very fond of lenses that perform double duty, in this case a good general purpose wide prime lens with a bright aperture that also turns in respectable close-up performance. Compare it to the earlier EF 35mm f2, which can only manage 0.24 times magnification, making it much less suitable for close-up work. The f1.8 focal ratio may not reach the heights of the exotic f1.2 primes in the RF system, but it can still deliver nice shallow depth of field effects with attractive rendering, and obviously in a much more compact and affordable package. Here's the RF 35mm with the aperture wide open at f1.8 and from 50cm away from the subject, in order to compare it to the more distant minimum focusing distance of the RF 24-240 that I'll show you later on. Closing the aperture to f2 reduces the vignette more than anything else, but as you close further to 2.8, the bokeh blobs in the corners become more circular and there's greater evidence of the 9-blade aperture system. And now at f4, then f5.6, f8, f11 and f16. Now I'd like to compare the RF 35mm 1.8 on the left against the RF 24-105 f4-7.1 STM on the right. The zoom I set to 35mm to match the field of view, where the maximum aperture on that lens becomes f4.5, and as you can see there's a huge difference in the potential for blurring between f1.8 and 4.5, plus of course the brighter aperture means more light gathered and faster shutter speeds or lower ISO sensitivities. For example, with the sensitivity fixed to 100 ISO, the f1.8 lens required a shutter speed of an 80th of a second versus an 1/8 of a second for the zoom when it was at f4.5. Next, I'd like to compare the RF 35mm 1.8 on the left against the RF 24-240mm on the right, where I've set the zoom to 35mm to match the field of view, at which point that lens's aperture closes to f4.5. You can see that there is a very big difference between shooting at f1.8 and f4.5, both in terms of the depth of field and the exposure that you can use. Now, I made this comparison at the closest distance that all three lenses could manage in order to compare them, with the RF 24-240mm setting the lowest bar in this regard of 50cm, but of course both zooms can increase their focal lengths. So for another comparison, I retested each lens at each of their closest focusing distances, longest focal lengths and maximum apertures at that length. First, here's the RF 24-240mm from 50cm away, but at 240mm f6.3. And now for the RF 24-105mm from 34cm, but zoomed to 105mm f7.1. But they're a far cry from the RF 35mm at its closest focusing distance of 17cm and wide open to f1.8. So if you want big bokeh blobs, a bright aperture and closer focusing distance easily outweigh the longer focal lengths and dimmer apertures of those two zooms. Next, let's see how the built-in Optical.IS can steady the image for photos, starting with a recording of the view with the stabilization turned off, where it's unsurprisingly wobbly, especially at close range. And now with the IS switched on, there is a visible improvement, which again not only helps you handhold at slower shutters, but also more easily frame the shot. It's also invaluable for handheld videos I'll show you in a minute. To test the optical quality, I shot this landscape scene with the RF 35mm 1.8 at all apertures, with the composition angled so that fine details extends right into the corners. Don't worry, I wasn't drunk. Taking a close look in the middle shows a good degree of detail, although stopping down a little will see the resolution increase, especially from f2.8 onwards. Okay, now back to the f1.8 version, and this time let's look at the corners, where there's a little softness, although depth of field can have an impact even for distant subjects. Either way, closing the aperture to f2, then to f2.8 increases the sharpness in the corners, but there's a big improvement in the corner sharpness that begins at f4, with further benefits at f5.6 and f8. So while the performance across the frame is pretty respectable wide open, I'd close to f8 for the best landscape results, or f4 at the least. For comparison, I also shot the same scene moments later with the RF 24-105 f4L zoom. Yes, that's the higher end model, not the cheaper STM version that I showed in my bokeh comparisons earlier. Here's a close-up of the middle of the frame from the RF 35 1.8 on the left, and the RF 24-105 f4L on the right, and that zoom was set to 35mm to match the field of view, and both set to f4. Now here the detail in the middle looks similar, although move out to the corners and the RF 35mm 1.8 at the same f4 aperture looks much superior. In fact, in the corners, I'd say the RF 24-105 f4L when set to f4 looks a lot like the RF 35 1.8 does when it's set to f1.8. And in order to match the 35mm at f4, you'd need to close the zoom down to f8. So even though the RF 35 1.8 is a relatively low cost option in the series, it can actually match the premium zoom lens in the corners when set to brighter apertures. And now for a selection of images I shot with the RF 35 1.8 mounted on EOS R and RP bodies. Like other 35mm lenses, it's an ideal general purpose option, flexible enough for street, landscape, architecture, portrait and product photography. You already know about the macro capabilities, but they certainly make it more flexible in general use. The presence of optical stabilization is also invaluable for owners of Canon's unstabilized EOS R bodies, and it'll also work alongside the newer models with IBIS. Meanwhile, the f1.8 focal ratio means you can enjoy shallower depth of field effects than typical zooms, while also maintaining lower ISOs or faster shutter speeds in dim conditions. All reasons why I think everyone needs at least one bright prime lens in their system. Now for some video tests, starting with some handheld clips I filmed with the RF 35mm 1.8 in 1080p using the EOS RP body. The combination of close focusing, shallow depth of field and optical stabilization make it a great lens for filming. It's as useful a general purpose option for video as it is for still photos. Driven by Canon's dual pixel autofocus system, it's also a confident focuser, and thankfully when filming video the motors slow down to become virtually inaudible. It's quite a contrast compared to the noise it makes when focusing for stills. In this test, I've used the touchscreen to pull focus between the ornament and the lights around it. As you already know, the Canon bodies are great at face tracking, but here's an example nonetheless, filmed at f1.8, where you can enjoy some nice subject separation. Now 35mm is a bit too long for handheld vlogging unless you're using a very long stick, but it's perfect for static pieces to camera from slightly further away. That said, it wouldn't be a Camera Labs review without a quick vlogging segment, so indulge me for a moment before my final verdict. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is a quick vlogging test with a Canon RF 35mm f1.8 macro mounted on an EOS RP body. Now I'm filming in 1080 at 25p. Now the 35mm focal length is way too long. This is far too tight for handheld filming, and I'm even actually trying to hold the camera a bit further away from me than normal. I've got it mounted on a full-size tripod with one of the legs actually extended out and pushing into my chest. It's extremely painful, but hey, you know, the benefit of looking this ridiculous is that people really do observe the 2 meter social distancing rule, because no one wants to get near anyone who looks as ridiculous as I do right now. Okay, a couple of other details. The EOS RP, as you know, is an unstabilized body, so the stabilization you see here is provided entirely optically by the lens alone, and I'd say it's actually doing a fairly effective job, although that's also helped by this big tripod that I've got the camera mounted on. Oh, and I'm also recording sound with the built-in microphones. Now, of course, there are now stabilized bodies available in the EOS R system, but this lens with its optical stabilization is a real boon for those with the original RP or R or any other unstabilized bodies. It does work really well. So while I wouldn't really use this lens for handheld vlogging, it is still really good for filming pieces to camera if you're a little bit further away, maybe mounted on a tripod, or if you've got someone else to film you for you. Okay, I think that's enough for this section. Hope you found it useful, and now on to my final verdict. The Canon RF 35mm f1.8 IS Macro STM is a mild wide-angle prime lens for the EOS R full-frame mirrorless system and remains the smallest, lightest and most affordable model in the native catalogue to date. Like other 35mm lenses, it's an ideal general-purpose option, flexible enough for street, landscape, architectural product and even wider portrait photography. Like most prime lenses, it'll outperform many zooms at larger apertures, while the brighter f1.8 focal ratio allows you to achieve shallower depth of field effects too, and maintain lower ISOs or faster shutters in dim conditions. Making it more useful still though are macro credentials, which may miss out on true one-to-one reproduction, but will still deliver 1:2 or 50% magnification from a distance of 17 cm, which is close enough for many of us. The icing on the cake is optical stabilization, allowing you to handhold slower shutters or film video with ease on the unstabilized EOS R bodies. Now, you can't exactly call a $500 lens cheap, but the RF 35mm 1.8 does more than enough to justify its inclusion in every EOS R owner's bag. If you're tempted mostly for the macro capabilities though, do also consider the more recent RF 85mm f2, which delivers the same 1:2 reproduction but from twice as far away, which may make it more practical depending on your subject. The 85 is also more appropriate for portrait work, but personally speaking, the 35 gets my vote for its sheer flexibility as an all-rounder, and as such it comes highly recommended. In the absence of a thrifty 50, it's as close to being a no-brainer in the RF system as I've seen to date. Right, that's it for another lens review. I'm thinking of testing most or even all of the Canon RF lenses, so do let me know if that's something you'd like to see, as these videos do actually involve a lot of work. As always, if you found any of it useful, please do give it a like and me a follow, and if you really enjoyed it, you can treat me to a coffee or treat yourself to my in-camera photography book, or how about some Camera Labs merchandise. There's links for all of this, including the latest prices for the lens, in the description and pinned comment below. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.